Welcome back to Military Law Talks. So today's video is on the DRP and VERA, the voluntary early retirement. So an email went out today to the DoD workforce detailing the DoD's version of the DRP, the Deferred Resignation Program. And so let's take a look at the email. Okay, so this email was sent today, April 1st, not an April Fool's joke. It is actually here. So it was sent out to all DoD civilians. And so I'm going to read from the email. So it says, for Department of Defense civilian employees, as the Secretary of Defense directed, this is a notification to the Department of Defense civilian employees that the DoD will conduct its own Deferred Resignation Program, the DRP, and offer voluntary early retirement authority, VERA, to all eligible civilian employees in conjunction with or independent of the DRP. The DoD DRP provides a generous opportunity for employees to enter a paid leave status for several months prior to resigning or retiring. Employees pending approval or approved for the DoD DRP will not be subject to return to in-person work requirements. The DoD DRP will generally adopt the voluntary separation framework established by the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, DRP with the modifications detailed below. The principal staff assistants, PSAs, and the DoD component heads will administer the DoD DRP and VERA for their respective employees. Exemptions to the DRP should be rare. PSAs and DoD component heads are authorized to exempt mission-critical positions prior to offering the DoD DRP and VERA, and to disapprove employee requests to participate subject to the following. The secretaries of the military departments must obtain a concurrence of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff prior to exempting employees assigned to the Combatant Command or CJCS controlled activity. The directors of the defense agencies and the DoD field activities must obtain concurrences of their controlling PSA prior to exempting employees of the DAFA under authority, direction, and control of the PSA. The PSAs and the DoD component heads will ensure that all eligible employees in their respective organizations are notified of the availability of the DoD DRP and VERA and are provided with the means to elect to participate. PSAs and DoD component heads will conduct an analysis required by Section 129A of Title 10 U.S. Code when determining which positions will be exempt. They will also consider the loss of that position's impact on readiness and performance of the mission essential functions. In addition, PSAs and DoD component heads will develop procedures to offer the DoD DRP and VERA to their respective workforces. These procedures will ensure consistency to the maximum extent possible among similarly situated employees. PSAs and DoD component heads will offer the DoD DRP from April 7th, 2025 through April 14th, 2025. An employee may elect retirement pursuant to VERA without participating in the DoD DRP. Employees approved for the DoD DRP or VERA must leave federal service by September 30th, 2025. The DoD DRP is not available for non-appropriated fund employees, foreign, local, national employees, dual status military technicians, highly qualified experts, or re-employed annuitants. Probationary employees are eligible to participate in the DoD DRP. Employees participating in the DoD DRP will begin administrative leave no earlier than May 1st, 2025. Before beginning administrative leave, employees must enter into a written agreement to resign or retire by September 30th, 2025. Retiring employees will not be permitted to extend until December 31st, 2025. Please direct any specific questions to your DoD component or PSA HR lead. So, some major differences between this and the DOGE, like the OPM offered DRP, is a big one is the retiring. If you're retiring pursuant to the DRP, you must retire by September 30th, 2025. Now, the earlier DRP offered by OPM allowed people to retire effective 31 December. And so this DoD DRP only is allowing it until September 30th. But other than that, it's pretty similar. Big things that I want to point out is that it does say that exemptions should be rare. So if you elect to participate, your participation should be approved unless you're in a mission critical position, but those, again, should be rare. Another thing that I want to point out is, well, what's VERA? So some people have asked this question, what's VERA? So it's Voluntary Early Retirement Authority. That's what VERA stands for. But this is essentially, it's a voluntary early retirement. And I'm going to go over who would be eligible for VERA. So let me pull this off my screen. Okay, so for voluntary early retirement, this is from OPM's website. And this is what are the requirements. And so employees have to meet certain requirements to be eligible for the voluntary early retirement. And those are at least 50 years of age with at least 20 years of credible federal service, or any age with at least 25 years of credible federal service. And then you have to be in a position that's covered and covered by the agency's VERA plan. So the DoD does have specific statutory authority for VERA. They don't actually have to go through OPM. They can have their own VERA program. So if you're an employee who meets these requirements, you would be eligible for the VERA under the DoD's program. And but remember, if you go through the DRP, your retirement date would need to be 30 September 2025. And the only benefit I see of doing DRP versus just retiring or doing VERA outside of the DRP program would be exemption from that return to work requirement. So if you're a remote employee and want to participate in DRP but are eligible for VERA, I would recommend that would be the course of action that you would take. Now, if you don't need to worry about the return to work requirements, you're already working where you're assigned, then you may just want to participate in VERA, and have your own date, especially if you want to have a later date later in the year. And then just know, if you do take the early retirement, it would affect your payout for retirement pay. And you can do calculations to determine what your retirement pay would be when you take VERA. Okay, I'm going to take this down and then share. Okay, and then again, the email said that exemptions to being eligible for DRP should be rare. If the agency head determines that a position should not be included in the DRP program, it does need to be mission essential, and they do need to take into requirements of the 10 USC 29 alpha. And so I'm just going to highlight the portions that they should take into consideration. So obviously it's a statute about total force management. How do we have the most effective, like cost effective, really they're looking at cost effective mix of military, civilian, and contract personnel. And things that they should take into consideration are whenever we're doing any sort of reductions, either reduction in force or like this is a type of shape management, is allowing these voluntary means for people to leave government service. So anytime we take those into consideration, this is what the agency, particularly the DoD, should take into consideration. So it should the factors they should consider are workload, military force structure, lethality, readiness, operational effectiveness, stress on the military force, and fully burdened cost. Because if the DoD meets their goals of reducing the DoD civilian workforce by 8%, theoretically, potentially, right, some individuals maybe will have to be replaced by military members. And so that could have an impact on readiness or lethality, et cetera. So those are things that they should consider, particularly normally with like a RIF of reduction in force, which I'm going to do a later video on reduction in forces, what those are. The agency heads would take into consideration where we can cut the workforce, and it's a kind of across the board cuts, versus these voluntary programs. They are, they're kind of, bottom down, or down at the bottom making those decisions instead of like a top down making decisions. And so it's the individual employees making the decisions to elect to leave service. And so some of those positions could be mission critical or could be important jobs that are historically only done by civilians. And so how to replace them with a military member. So that's something that the agencies will have to take into consideration to determine which positions should be mission critical and not subject to DRP. But again, the message from the top, the message from SecDef, the message from the DoD is that they want to maximize the amount of voluntary removals, essentially, that they want the maximum participation of civilians participating in these voluntary measures so that maybe they'll meet that 8% and then they won't have to take involuntary measures. And then another thing that I want to point out is that the email was clear that probationary employees are eligible for DRP. And at that point, I want to foot stomp I think the DoD is kind of foot stomping here. Hey, probationary employees, you're kind of next on the chopping block, per se, to make that 8%. And so potentially this is a great opportunity for you to take advantage of being put on administrative leave, still getting a paycheck until 30 September versus maybe being the first to go when they do some involuntary measures. So just something to think about, but I do want to encourage you to watch my first video on DRP and understand that there are serious ethical obligations that you do have to consider if you take the DRP. So just know, if you want to go work for a government contractor, there's severe limitations based on criminal conflict of interest statutes that would limit your ability to go work for a government contractor while you're still working for the federal government. Because remember, if you elect to take in the DRP program, you're still employed by the federal government. So you're still a government employee until that 30 September date, or an earlier date if you choose to have an earlier date. And so you could go get another job, but ethics rules may limit that other job. So just some things to consider. And I'll keep watching this space. And if you've enjoyed this content or gotten any value out of this content, please consider liking this video, sharing this video to others, and subscribe to my channel. I'm a new channel, so please help me spread the word. Help my channel grow. So consider subscribing and sharing my video out there. Thanks so much for joining me. Catch you in the next video.